A lot of good Christmas colors here. Dickens and Christmas, Healing the Fractured Self is the theme of this. You've probably heard the phrase that Dickens is the man who invented Christmas. In fact, there was a film that came out a few years ago with that title, with Dan Stevens in it, and there's a book of that title. And actually the phrase goes way back to one of his original illustrators. Sorry about my dog, F.G. Kiton. Dickens loved dogs, by the way, so I think this is a good sign. I've written about Dickens and dogs too, but that's not the theme here. So he's often been called the man who invented Christmas, but of course he didn't invent Christmas. Christmas had been around for 1,843 years before he kind of revived it. So that's really his role with Christmas. He kind of breathed more life into the celebration of Christmas. And obviously Christmas Carol is one of the main ways in which he did it. And I'm sure, like me, you get kind of bombarded with versions of Christmas Carol this time of year. I have several favorite film versions. Usually most of the theaters around us are doing theatrical versions of Christmas Carol, or live readings. Our local public radio station does a live reading of Christmas Carol. So it's kind of all over the place, almost to the point where you can get tired of it. I never get tired of it, but because it's a wonderful story. So that is really kind of carved Dickens's niche into Christmas traditions. And so what's interesting is he writes about Christmas traditions and how important they are, but he has become one of our largest Christmas traditions. Interestingly enough, I don't know how much of you know of Dickens, but Christmas Carol was not his only Christmas book. He wrote several others. One was Cricket on the Hearth. One was The Haunted Man. There's one called The Battle of Life. I wouldn't bother reading that one. And The Chimes. And those are his major Christmas books. They'll come after A Christmas Carol. None of them is as good as A Christmas Carol, but The Haunted Man, this image here on the right, that's a good one. And it shares a lot of the themes of A Christmas Carol, including kind of ghosts, and one of the themes I'm going to explore tonight. I do want to clarify, though, that while Dickens is so famous for having kind of revived the celebration of Christmas, he was not the first to do so. So Washington Irving, obviously American author, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle. Washington Irving kind of was the first one to start revivifying the celebration of Christmas in his book, The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, which came out in 1819, 1820, whereas Christmas Carol came out in 1843. Dickens loved Irving, met Irving, refers to him and has letters with him, refers to him in his writings. So Washington Irving takes this kind of nostalgic tour of England and Christmas practices, old-time Christmas practices in England, in this book, The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. He has 5 chapters devoted to Christmas, and they describe what it's like to celebrate Christmas at an old-fashioned country estate. And I say it's nostalgic, and since 1819 it's nostalgic because the practice of Christmas was really on the wane. So that started with the Puritans in the 17th century. The Puritans didn't like Christmas in terms of a celebration. They would have a Christmas religious service. But Christmas festivities, especially since they were kind of mapped onto winter solstice festivities, which could be really kind of like boisterous and full of a lot of booze and, dancing and singing, that was just too kind of rowdy for the Puritans and too sensual. And they didn't want that. So with the Puritan influence in the 17th century, both in the UK and then over here in America, the practice of Christmas was really kind of starting to be marginalized, pushed to the sides in the name of a much more subdued celebration. But with people like Washington Irving and Charles Dickens, they thought, wow, these were great practices. And, the practices had kind of continued to in some form, but they were more subtle. And especially people in the upper classes, middle and upper classes, were almost embarrassed to be making a whole big deal of Christmas because of this route. I won't be able to say a lot about this one. That's a whole other talk, and maybe I can do that one with you at some time too. But one of the other major influences on A Christmas Carol is the Lowell Mill women. So when Dickens came to the United States in 1842, the year before he wrote A Christmas Carol, he went up to Lowell, Massachusetts. It's about 30 miles north of Boston. He went there because it was a planned industrial city, and he was very interested in how industry was run. He had toured factories in England, and he'd been horrified by the child labor practices. And so he had heard that it was done better in the US. So when he came over here to the US to write a travel narrative about America, he went up to Lowell. And he later wrote in his travel narrative, which is called American Notes, that Lowell was the happiest day he spent in the US, which is kind of amazing because he loved Boston too. He went to New York. He went out and saw the plains. He saw Niagara Falls. This industrial city was his happiest day. Why? Because what he saw there, like on the right, you can see these child laborers. These are child laborers in England. They would put kids of 6, 7 years old, make them work 12 to 16-hour days. They were so small they had to climb up on the machinery to make it work, which meant a lot of them lost life, and if not life, sometimes limbs. He saw that, and he saw parliamentary reports about those practices. In Lowell, what he saw was older workers, healthy women, much better working conditions. And Lowell had set up boarding houses right next to the factory so that the factory workers didn't have to commute. The boarding houses were healthy. They had pianos. They had their own lecture series like you guys do. And in addition to all that, the Lowell Mill women were treated well enough so that they had time when they came back from their day of work to write their own magazine. It's called the Lowell Offering. And it ran for 5 years, 1840 to 45. So when Dickens visited them in 1842, again, the year before he wrote A Christmas Carol, they gave him the first 2 years of the Lowell Offering. And it's a great magazine. I've read all of it. It's got great stories, essays, poetry, etc. Extremely well written, surprisingly well written. And he read everything that they gave him. And he writes in American Notes that it was amazingly well done, this Lowell Offering. And he said it compares very favorably to annuals that came out in England. And he said in American Notes that he read all 400 pages of it from beginning to end with real pleasure. So he reads this, and a year later he's writing A Christmas Carol. And in the talk that I can't give tonight, but I just want to give a shout out to the Lowell Mill women, there are a lot of images and patterns and themes and plot lines from the Lowell Offering that end up kind of being transformed and transported into A Christmas Carol. So Washington Irving, Lowell Offering, and some of Dickens's earlier writings about Christmas, like in the Pickwick Papers that Anne read, are the major influences on A Christmas Carol. Why is this one so popular? Why is it persisted? Why are we inundated with Christmas carols this time of year? When he did write 4 other Christmas books and then many other Christmas issues of the journals that he edited later on, Household Words and All the Year Round. Well, there's multiple reasons. Number one, it's a ghost story. People love ghost stories. And ghost stories traditionally were told a lot, particularly around the winter solstice, because all these, the days are getting shorter, it's dark. People, pre-Christian folks kind of felt this was the time of year when there was the thinnest veil between this world and the next world. So this was a great time for ghost stories. And it's a ghost story. I mean, it's the subtitle of A Christmas Carol, if you didn't know. It's called A Christmas Carol, A Ghost Story of Christmas. So we like ghost stories. Kind of atmospheric and mysterious, and they suggest that there's life after death, which is reassuring. It also has a happy ending. Who doesn't love a happy ending? And it's a happy ending that involves redemption. Well, who doesn't want to be redeemed? Who doesn't want to have a second chance to get it right? And that's so much about what Christmas Carol is about. It also is a wonderful example of how Dickens weaves humor and pathos, the emotions that make you cry, that appeal to your sentiment. This is kind of a standard Dickens characteristic, that he was really good at getting those funny scenes right up against the scenes that make you cry, because he understood that if you could kind of pull your reader in both directions, you'd get the maximum impact emotional impact. And he put them side by side because it kind of throws you off guard, right? So you're laughing 1 second, and then suddenly he kills a child, and then you're weeping. He called this the streaky bacon theory. You know, bacon is like meat, fat, meat, fat. Humor, pathos, humor, pathos. This is his version of streaky bacon. Another reason I think Christmas Carol is so popular is because it has these wonderful sensory details. And if we have time, I might read you one passage where he goes on for 2 pages, simply describing the produce and nuts in a Christmas window, shop window. And he anthropomorphizes, personifies every single fruit and nut that he talks about. And it's so that the whole window just seems alive. And it also kind of makes your mouth water because it all sounds so delicious. So it's so much sensory detail. And of course, that's one of the things that's wonderful about Christmas, is that there's so many ways in which Christmas is evocative to us, because it appeals to so many different senses. Like, we just put up our Christmas tree yesterday, and so the whole house smells like evergreen, such a, wonderful scent. And then I'll bake cookies, in a week or so, and there'll be those scents. And then there's all the foods, the tastes, and the sights of the lights, and the sounds of the bells and the carols. It appeals to every single sense. And Dickens captures that in a carol. It's also a very tightly structured story, which not all of Dickens's novels are. If you have read Dickens novels, you'll know that they are what Henry James called baggy monsters. So they'll be like, why is that scene there? It's just, they're big, and I love that. I mean, I love the messiness of a Dickens novel, but it's not for everybody. Christmas Carol is really nicely structured into these 5 parts that he calls staves, just like a 5-part play. 5-act play. So it's got that kind of classic 5-act play structure, which is one of the reasons it translates so nicely to theatrical versions. And then I'd say, and this is what I'm going to focus on more, many Dickens critics have talked about the carol philosophy, that there's a kind of whole philosophy of life that he presents here that continues to resonate, continues to speak to us, maybe even speaks to us more now than it perhaps did to early Victorians when he wrote it. But what is this carol philosophy? And here I'm just going to throw out, like, if you had to make a statement, like, what is Christmas Carol trying to say about how to live life? Any ideas? What would you say, Mariah?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing is kindness, being, seeing Tiny Tim and Ebenezer Scrooge both as sort of equally deserving of kindness. And some of those beautiful speeches that nephew Fred gives.
Right, exactly. Yeah, excellent. And in fact, you could summarize probably all of Dickens' philosophy with that one word. And in fact, the Dalai Lama says you could summarize all of world philosophy with one word: kindness. So it's a good word to pick. Anybody else? Any other ideas? In addition to kindness, which does kind of encapsulate everything?
I was going to say kind of just friends and family over money, time with people you care about over making money.
Yeah, absolutely. Valuing the human beings around you more than accruing gold, and et cetera. Good. So yeah, being generous to others, keeping a generous spirit, friends, family, co-workers, that, mentioned Fred and Bob Cratchit, who, despite the fact that they don't have much money, or maybe because they don't have much money, just are very alive emotionally still. I'd say it also incorporates just living fully in the moment. Remember when Scrooge is redeemed, he just like jumps right in. It's not like, I'm going to make a confession now and I'm going to give money, but he's like doing it in a dour way. No, he's dancing, he's shouting. He goes to Fred's house finally to participate in the celebration. He learns to live fully, which is what the Ghost of Christmas Present tries to teach him. There's one aspect of the philosophy, though, that I think is really key, and it's deeply embedded in the whole novella, as well as the novella Haunted Man, but it may not seem as overt. And that is that everyone needs to remember. And by that, I mean like remember, like all of us are kind of fragmented people. I just learned and just meeting you guys, but I know Mariah hasn't lived in Chestertown forever, and Anne hasn't either. You have different parts of your life. I only lived there for 3 years because my junior year I lived in England. I've lived, I think my husband and I moved 13 times before we moved into our house. And in every different place you live, and every different job you have, and every different, relationship you're in, when you move on, you leave some of that behind. So you can feel very, very fractured and fragmented. And I think one of the things that Dickens is advocating in A Christmas Carol is that we need to take time at Christmas, because it is such a time of nostalgia and thinking back over the years, and we do have these recurring traditions that help bring our past back. We need to reconnect our fragmented parts of ourselves into some kind of coherent whole. The Haunted Man Christmas book that Dickens wrote, it was his last one, and I've mentioned it, I showed you the cover illustration, has this recurring motto, Lord, keep my memory green as in, growing and alive, because Dickens saw that as such a central part to being a healthy human being for your own good, right? but for the good of others, so that you could connect with others. We see this theme, really starting to emerge as important in the visit with the first Christmas ghost, but not the first ghost, because we've already seen Marley. When the ghost of Christmas Past takes the young Scrooge back to watch his own self, left alone at a school at Christmas time, a boarding school, in a cold, barren room, and all he has for company is his books, which is kind of like Dickens at certain points in his life, when he was abandoned by his family when he was age 12, because they were thrown in debtor's prison, and he had to live on his own at age 12 in London, and he worked in a boot blacking factory. He felt very abandoned, alone there, and his books were one of his sole sources of comfort. When the Ghost of Christmas Past takes Scrooge back to witness his lonely self as a young boy, Scrooge, for the first time, weeps. And as soon as he weeps for himself, as soon as he feels for himself, that's the beginning of his redemption. It kind of breathes life into his emotional self. And the first thing he says after he weeps for himself is, oh, I wish I'd given some money to that little boy who came by caroling at my office today. I should have done something. I should have said something. And he wishes he could, but he can't take it back now, right? So the second he can start feeling for himself and reliving those memories of his past, he's already becoming more human and having regrets and starting that path of redemption. So why is this theme of remembering, bringing back your fragmented parts of yourself, so important to Dickens? Well, one of the reasons is because, Dickens is alive and facing the impact of the Industrial Revolution and urbanization. So in the course of the 1800s, London went from a city of 1 million people to a city of 7 million people, so a 700% increase. And so people were starting to feel really like alienated from each other, just like many of us do who live in cities. You don't really smile and say hi to everybody you see because you can't, there's too many people. And many people probably felt this fragmentation, this being cut off from their past, because many of these 7 million people who are crawling into London, that's not where they grew up. They grew up in the countryside. They grew up in an agrarian economy, and now it's this urban economy with industrialization. So they're losing touch with the past, losing touch with their families, losing touch with their neighbors. And it just is this kind of enemy, this social chaos. So Dickens is right in the heart of that. He's seeing that as a problem. But also on a personal level, when Dickens writes Christmas Carol, he's only, he's 31 years old, so young, but he already has 4 kids. So he's growing family. He's got to feed four kids and a wife. And his parents, who were always profligate and never had money, were always hitting him up for money, as were his siblings. as were philanthropists. So when Scrooge has those two philanthropists who come by his office asking for a donation at Christmas time, and he just barks at them, Dickens probably felt that way. Scrooge is not some kind of weird, distant character that Dickens is saying, like, yeah, that's a terrible person. You should never be like Scrooge. Dickens is writing Scrooge thinking, this is pretty much how I feel right now. I feel like pestered. I feel fragmented. I like everybody needs my money. And he actually writes A Christmas Carol, in fact, to make money. Of course, he is a writer. He has to, but he's particularly writing this book, A Christmas Book, because he thinks it'll really profit him. And his last book didn't make much money. So he needs to make money. He's thinking about money, and he's feeling really irritated and maybe cut off from his own past self. Because at age 12, he was onto boot blacking bottles, living by himself. Less than 20 years later, he is the world's most famous novelist and treated like a pop culture celebrity in the US. He must have felt really fragmented from his past self. So I think these are some of the things that are inspiring him when he writes A Christmas Carol. But of course, this theme of the importance of memory is not new to Dickens. It's a major theme for the Romantic poets, who I first studied at Washington College under the tutelage of Dr. Rich Gillen. I don't know if he still lives in the area, but awesome class. And I've used it many times in my life. But particularly poets like Wordsworth, who Dickens would have had known very well, not personally, but known his works very well as he was growing up. Wordsworth talks in poems like I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud about how important it is to really kind of seal key memories for yourself so that you can feed off of them later on in life. And in I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, he has talked in the earlier stanzas about walking in a beautiful lake district and coming over the top of a hill and then suddenly seeing this field of 10,000 daffodils, just so vibrant and waving in the breeze, and just takes his breath away. And he has this wonderful memory of it, which he then feeds on in really kind of at times of sadness, sorrow, depression. As he says here, for oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they, the daffodils, flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and in my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So the importance of memory and just keeping you in touch with your former self and giving you things to feed off of in dark times like the ones we're in right now. I won't read all of this, but it's just another Ode, Intimations of Immortality, another poem where Wordsworth writes about the importance of memory and in keeping yourself whole and healthy as you go through life.
Natalie?
Yes.
Do you mind sharing your slides with us after the presentation?
Oh, of course. I'll just so actually I think I sent them to you.
I've got them. So if that's okay, I will share them with others.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Share them with others. So Dickens is kind of taking this theme of remembering memory he's evolving it from the Romantics and from his own feeling perhaps of being fragmented, fractured, and cut off from his early self. And I'd say the main difference is that Dickens is focusing on the self in society. And so the importance of remembering for Dickens is so that you can be somebody who's really present for those around you. So this is from the original John Leech illustrations of A Christmas Carol. It's just Scrooge and Bob Cratchit sharing a glass of smoking bishop at the end of A Christmas Carol. A wonderful scene. So the society was a big part of this for Dickens, as it is for most Victorians. But for the Romantics, it wasn't so much self in society. It was solitude. They were much more solitary. And this is one of the classic paintings, Romantic paintings, by Caspar David Friedrich from 1819, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. If you had to find one image that sums up all of Romanticism, that's it. And it's really interesting. I've never been able to trace, but this is 1819, this image. And the same year, Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein. And she's got a scene in it where Victor Frankenstein is like I think at the top of Mont Blanc looking out at the Sea of Fog. And I've never understood, did they just simultaneously come up with the same image? because it is so iconic of Romanticism. Or did she know this painting, or did he know Frankenstein? I have not been able to figure it out, but it's an iconic romantic image. But of course, it ties into this theme that I'm developing about, needing to kind of resuscitate those memories of different parts of your life, even the painful ones. Because in The Haunted Man, which is this image here, where there's the motto, which I mentioned before, Lord, keep my memory green. The chief protagonist in The Haunted Man is somebody who has really painful memories, and he has asked God to take his memories away so he's not so sad all the time. And he's granted that wish. And he just becomes so embittered without his memories, even the painful ones at least humanized him. Now he's just this bitter, depleted, barely human creature. And everyone he encounters, he kind of bestows that curse on them that they have no memory either. So the end of Haunted Man, not spoiler alert, I'm sure you're all going to go out and read it. The end of Haunted Man, he gets his memory back and everybody does. And they have this wonderful feast in this hall with the motto over it, Lord, keep my memory green. So I think if you had to sum up the Carol philosophy, it's this idea that if you're really going to be a whole person, happy, centered, and able to relate in a real human way to other people, you need to stay in touch with your past. You need to kind of continually revivify those memories, as we often do at Christmas time through all the different traditions we celebrate. But you also need, of course, to keep in mind what the future is, because that's the ghost of Christmas yet to come, the future, which is death, which is where everybody's heading. And that helps make you appreciate the present. So if you can keep your past alive, your memories alive, and you can keep in mind where we're all heading, the common denominator of us all, then hopefully you can be really alive in the present, like the ghost of Christmas present here. And of course, that's where Scrooge ends up in the end. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons they teach. Or to quote Eleanor Roosevelt, who I think was riffing on this, yesterday is history, tomorrow's a mystery, and today is a gift. That's why they call it the present. That's it.
Wow. Thank you.
Welcome.
Oh,
I love that.
Christmas
That there's so many pieces of that are really resonating with me about memory, and the fact that, looking at his past and connecting with his past opened up Scrooge's emotions, but he didn't change his behavior until he looked at the future.
Right. That's a good point.
And so that, that you need both of them.
Right.
Is really
it's that balance. I have my subtitle is, it's a classic Buddhist saying, right? Be here now, remember. It kind of gets it all into 4 words. Remember, be here now. To be here now in the present, you actually do have to remember, and not just remember the past, but remember where you're heading.
Right. Yeah, that's great. I'd love to hear what other people have to say.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing screen so I can see you all. There you are.
Oh, great.
And Anne has my slides, so feel free to share them with folks.
Thank you.
Yeah, we would love to do that.
Oh yeah, Michael.
Can you talk a little bit about the time period in which he wrote A Christmas Carol? I read that he did it just in a couple of weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. And I know he wrote his latter works at Gad's Hill, which is kind of interesting because based on what you said about memory, that apparently he saw that home on his walks from Chatham, and then he made enough money to wind up buying it. But the big expansive novels like, Great Expectations, Tale of Two Cities, were written in a Georgian mansion.
Just
and I'm just curious, where did he write A Christmas Carol? What was his kind of worldview, and how do you think it came to him that he was able to write it so quickly?
Yeah. It's interesting. So yes, his later books he wrote at Gad's Hill. He's still living in London at this point. So his first largish house, no, it's not that large. It's 48 Doughty Street in London. It's now the Dickens House Museum. But he wrote parts of Pickwick and Oliver Twist and parts of Nicholas Nickleby there. At this point, he's in London, but he's in Devonshire Terrace, but he's right in London. And he did write it quickly. Part of it was that he was in this kind of pressure cooker because he was writing simultaneously Martin Chuzzlewit, which was not a particularly successful novel, and he knew it, and he really needed to make money because he had all of these financial demands. So he had this idea to do a Christmas book as something that would be like a nice gift book at Christmas, and make some money. And it didn't make as much money as he had hoped because even though it was wildly popular, it was such an elaborate book design that the book cost a lot to make. If he could now draw 170 years of royalties from this one, he would have been, and of course he was wealthy by the end of his life. So he's kind of still hard pressed for money now, and was for a good number of years just because of the growing financial demand. So he's under a pressure cooker about money. But then there are two things that I wasn't able to talk about, kind of related to the Lowell Mill stuff I mentioned. So he had toured some UK factories in 1838 and was horrified. And he promised one of his friends that he was going to write some kind of piece about the factory workers because he was just outraged. And he said it was going to be a sledgehammer blow, but then he doesn't write anything. He was writing Nicholas Nickleby at that time, and there's nothing about factory workers there. There's stuff about Smike and the Yorkshire schools, but not factory workers. So he has this in his mind that he wants to give the sledgehammer blow about factory workers. Then he goes to Lowell and he sees a well-done factory or multiple, humane factories. And so that's kind of in his head. And then another thing happens when he comes back. He reads, there's a parliamentary report that comes out about child labor practices in the UK, and it is devastating. It's horrifying. And with testimonials from these young kids. I quote some of it in some of my other work on Dickens and the Lowell Mill girls. And that he read about 4 or 5 months before writing Christmas Carol. So he's got this tour of the factory, gets him steamed up, but he doesn't really do anything. Then he sees Lowell and he's like, wow, this could be done better. And then he reads this factory report about 4 or 5 months. And so I think it just, and then he had read the Lowell women's stories and things. And I think it really just kind of ends up being like this pressure cooker with all these ingredients added in, and it just comes bursting out. But it seems like it comes out of nowhere, but it doesn't. There's all these streams feeding that. He had one of those minds. I don't know if you know the movie Shakespeare in Love. I love that film. And one of the ways they depict Shakespeare in that is that he's somebody who's just like frenetic all the time, and he's walking through the bustling streets of London, and he's picking up these lines. You hear lines from his plays all around him, and it's just like it all just goes into his head, and then it comes out from his quill. And I think Dickens had one of those encyclopedic minds. He just remembered things, he held on to things, and when he got the steam going, enough steam going, it just comes out pretty quickly. Gad's Hill, that's great that you knew that. Yeah, Gad's Hill is the house that he died in 1870. This is the 150th anniversary of his death this year. And he had grown up in that area. It's in Kent, near Chatham. And he'd grown up in some of the years in Chatham. And he had walked by it when he was just like a 4 or 5-year-old boy with his father. And he said, oh, I like that house. I want to live there when I grow up. And then of course he did eventually make enough money to buy the place. And it's now a school. You can't tour it, which really bums me out. But
I'm surprised to hear that the Lowell factories were, an example, because everything I know about them is how awful they were.
It didn't last long. It's so sad. They really were. It was a planned industrial city with these kind of philanthropists who came together to have, factories that would make money, but it was really, they planned the lecture series. They put the pianos in the boarding houses. They let the women do this journal. But that only, the ideal, the Lowell ideal really only lasted 5 years. And then it just kind of, capitalism had its effect. There were immigrants coming into the US, they would work for cheaper than the women. And they, within, a few years after 1845, there were very few of the women living there, and the whole ideal fell apart. And now Lowell is one of the most depressed areas in Massachusetts. Not the most, but one of them. But there's the Lowell, I know it sounds crazy, but if you ever come up to this area, to Boston, you should go to Lowell, because there's a national park there, so you can actually walk through the boarding houses, and you can walk through the mills, and you can really see what they were going for. It's kind of an amazing moment in history, very utopian, but like most utopias, short-lived.
So what years was that?
So that it was working.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about 1838 to about 1845, and the Lowell Offering, the journal that they wrote, was 1840 to 1845. So kind of maps right on to when it was really working. And by even in those years, 1840 to 45, there were a couple strikes, because they were, capitalism works in the way that when you have more and more competition, you drive down the wages in order to make more money. And so their wages were getting driven down. And then they got pushed out. The Lowell Mill women are amazing, just amazing that they were able to do this journal. Most of them were working so that their brothers could go to college. They'd never go to college, but the brothers would go to Harvard.
Right. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So following that model, do you think that Scrooge, Ebenezer, is an avatar for avarice and greed and capitalism? And the name Ebenezer itself, isn't that maybe derived from an Old Testament?
Yeah, Old Testament. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say he's just an avatar. He obviously is a greedy, selfish person, but I think because Dickens does not just see him as an other, Dickens sees himself as becoming like this. I think what Dickens sees in Scrooge is what happens to all of us when we have severe financial pressures, we're exhausted, you get this time of year, the Giving Day was, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, I must have had like 150 different requests for money in my inbox. I mean, all of us, the mail this time of year is like a request. It's very easy to become Scrooge-like. So I think it's very important that, Dickens makes Scrooge actually kind of likable even when he's at his nastiest. And you can see this, and I don't have time to read it, but in the early scenes in Christmas Carol, when Scrooge is talking, he's kind of funny. He's very playful with language. He uses a lot of parallelism. He's kind of almost riffing on his own meanness. And I think that's Dickens's way of both showing, this guy has the potential for still being a human being. And this guy, Scrooge, he's kind of like me because he's a good writer, or he's good with language. So I think that's very important. If Scrooge was really just a nasty person, had no redeeming characteristics right from the start, I think it'd be harder for us to buy his redemption, and also harder for us to relate to him. If he's just somebody who's really awful who changes, that's not as good a story as he's somebody who's really awful in a way that we could all see ourselves perhaps getting under certain pressures.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about the fact that it's so early in the story that we see Marley, and that he actually does have a friend. I mean,
Yes.
He's dead, but
Right.
That he's capable of that kind of relationship.
That's an excellent point, because he does speak with almost a kind of affection towards Marley, even though he's dead, and really ghoulish, because his chin drops when he takes that chin cloth off. That's really gross. But yeah, they had a good relationship, business relationship. But yeah, he is capable, or was, and of course he has. He had been engaged. He'd fallen in love. Somebody had fallen in love with him. They're very, very key scenes. Yeah.
Natalie, you've definitely made me want to read this again, because your descriptions of his use of language and then talking about the produce and the nuts and the language around that, I don't really remember any of that. I mean, I feel like, honestly, probably for the past 20 years of my life, when I've encountered Christmas Carol, it's been in some sort of a theatrical production, which is wonderful, but I haven't actually sat down with the written word in a very long time. So this is making it come to life and make me want to dig that back up.
Yay. My life is complete. I'm so glad. No, absolutely. You should read it, because you're absolutely right. Almost everybody encounters A Christmas Carol now in a theatrical version, which leaves out I mean, you get the playfulness of the language and the dialogue some, but these descriptive scenes that are just maybe almost too much from some people, but they're so inventive. It's unbelievable. And there are other scenes that you don't tend to see. Like with the Ghost of Christmas Present, they go kind of traipsing all over the world, and they go into mines and see how miners are celebrating Christmas, and they go to a lighthouse, and how are people in a lighthouse celebrating Christmas, and those are really cool, and you don't tend to see those. So there's all kinds of good stuff to reward you if you actually read it. It's only about 73 pages, so it's not one of his 900-page novels.
Wow. Well, I see that, believe it or not, it's already 5:45. I want everybody to get a chance to make a comment or ask a question or anything if you like before we wrap up. But I'm so excited that we did this. I've had a lot of experience with Christmas Carol from I worked in a theater, and we did a version of it every year, like so many do. And ours did involve reading a lot of the sort of descriptive pieces through a narrator. And so that language is also, I can tell you, really great when it's heard as well as read. So I recommend that. But this has opened up a lot of sort of pieces of it that I hadn't thought of before, or in a long time.
I'm so glad. Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
It's also nice that you did it today, because today, a year ago, was the Dickens weekend here in Chestertown. So it's kind of a, happy, sad anniversary.
I know. I'm going to come to that. When COVID passes, I'm going to come and do the Dickens weekend. I would love it.
Oh, you should. It's amazing. There's like fire pits out on the street, and there's horses and wagons, and people costumes are unbelievable.
I love it. It's a perfect town for that.
Yeah, it really fits.
I look forward to it. I look forward to when we are on the other side of COVID-19.
Yes, well, when we are, and when you come, I hope that you'll definitely get in touch and let us know that you're here. And I know I thought that Kay McIntosh was going to be with us tonight, but I'm sure that she will watch the recording when we post it in a week or two, and she'll probably call you, and you'll get a gig for the next Dickens Festival anyway.
Love to.
Absolutely. Yeah, Kay's sign up when she signed up for the Salon said, "Oh, I can't wait to meet her because I want her to come next year to the festival."
She's not going to twist my arm much.
Excellent. And Colleen, I see that you've unmuted. Did you have any final comments before we go?
No, I thought it was really fascinating, and I also want to read it again. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Colleen. I mean, that truly is it's the highest praise for a Dickens scholar to hear that people are going to be reading him.
Absolutely.
Funny, I feel like
I love Dickens. I've read, several of his books, and I think he's fantastic.
He is. I feel like it was the right choice in terms of a author to focus on, because still when I go back, I laugh out loud and I cry. And that's after 30 years of more than 30 years of studying Dickens. So that's pretty amazing.
That is pretty amazing. I
we
hope
just-
that we will be able to invite you back to do another salon about the Lowell women.
Do it. Do
all
it.
that.
Yeah.
Happy to do
Love to
that.
get
Yep.
you on the calendar for that.
Yeah, I've
Awesome.
made all sorts of notes of more questions to ask and about, the gender studies. And, I want to know a little bit more about his celebrity. Like a lot of people during their lifetime aren't a celebrity and then they die and their works become famous. It's just, you brought up so many things. I think we have a lot more we can talk about in the future. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we usually do end with a toast. So I would like, thinking about the topic of the fractured self and that fragmented sense that we all have from the different parts of our life. I was thinking about, these times that we're in now, COVID, and a conversation I had recently with someone who told me that, she had heard somebody say something about pre-COVID, and it kind of hit her that this was going to be a new way that we define time and our memories and ourselves. We're going to say, I already do say, well, that was, pre-pandemic. And I think that is definitely going to be an example of a way that we're fragmented. So I would like to toast to recognizing those fragmentations and sort of the ability to be able to bring them together, even though we can't necessarily unfragment, we can still kind of put ourselves together and acknowledge all those different pieces. So I think the toast is to cohesion, internal and external cohesion. So thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you everyone for coming, and please do come back next time, and have a really great holiday if I don't see you before then.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. You're a great audience.
Thanks, Natalie.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you so much. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas and
Bye.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Bye.
all. Bye.